Hello, my name is Greg, and I am a co creator of the Lost Vessel channel. So, tonight it's a Spanish ship, the Santísima Trinidad. The Spanish called her El Escorial de los Mares, the Escorial of the Seas, which is a strange thing to call a warship because the Escorial is a palace. She's the only ship ever built with 4 full gun decks. 4. Nobody managed it before her, and nobody bothered after. I've been reading about her on and off for a couple of weeks now, and the odd thing is how much the sources argue with each other. Her gun count changes depending on who you read: 130, 140. Even the British officers who stood on her deck after Trafalgar couldn't agree on what they were looking at. Anyway, get comfortable, turn the light down, and let's talk about her.
There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over water at dawn, when the mist has not yet lifted and the sea seems to hold its breath before the work of the day begins. It was in such stillness, sailors of many flags would later say, that they first glimpsed her. A shape rising from the haze that seemed at first impossible, a shadow too tall and too broad to belong to any vessel built by human hands. And then the mist would thin, and the shape would resolve into wood and rigging and rank upon rank of gun ports, climbing higher than the eye expected a hull to climb, and the sailors would fall quiet because they were looking at a ship unlike any other that had ever been laid upon the sea. She was called the Santísima Trinidad, the Most Holy Trinity, and she rose 4 decks above her waterline, not 3, as was the custom among even the grandest ships of the line, but 4, a configuration so unusual that it would remain for more than 2 centuries entirely without equal. No other navy on earth, in the long and crowded history of sail, would build another ship quite like her. Other vessels would grow longer. Other vessels would carry heavier guns, or thicker armor, or greater speed. But no nation, in the age of wood and canvas, would again attempt to stack a 4th tier of cannon atop a hull and send it to sea as a functioning warship. She stands alone in that respect even now, centuries after her last gun fired and her last timber settled into the silt of the Atlantic floor. She was, in the truest sense, an experiment that succeeded long enough to become a legend, and that legend has never quite faded. To stand at the edge of a harbour in the late 18th century and watch her enter port was, by every account that survives, to feel something shift in the chest. A kind of vertigo, sailors said. The same disorientation one might feel standing beneath a cathedral for the first time and realizing the ceiling is simply too far away. She displaced more water than any fighting ship of her age. She carried more cannon than any ship that had sailed before her, and for some time after her launch, more than any ship that would sail after. British sailors who fought against her, French officers who sailed beside her, and Spanish crews who served aboard her all left behind. The same impression, phrased in different languages but carrying the same weight of astonishment. That she seemed less like a ship than like a floating fortress, a wall of oak and iron that had somehow been persuaded to move across open water. It did not take long for a nickname to attach itself to her, and the nickname traveled faster than any official record of her dimensions. Sailors began to call her El Escorial de los Mares, the Escorial of the Seas, comparing her to the vast royal monastery and palace outside Madrid, a building so large and so solemn that it seemed to belong to a different scale of human ambition altogether. Others, less poetic but no less admiring, simply called her the largest ship in the world, a title that would follow her for the remainder of her service and long into the writing of naval history. Whether that title was strictly, mathematically true depended on how one measured a ship in an age before standardized tonnage, a question that would occupy historians and naval architects for generations to come, and one this chronicle will return to in its proper place. But in the years she sailed, among the men who saw her, there was no serious argument. She was the giant among giants, and everyone who set eyes on her seemed to understand this without needing to be told. This is her story, not simply the story of a battle, though a battle would eventually claim her, but the fuller story of how a ship of such improbable scale came to exist at all. It is the story of an empire reaching for a kind of permanence through timber and iron, of a colonial shipyard asked to build beyond its experience, of shipwrights who had never attempted a fourth deck and were told, nonetheless, to attempt it. It is the story of the decades she spent under the Spanish flag, carrying treasure and troops and the pride of a nation across the Atlantic, and of the single autumn day off a Spanish headland when her size, which had always been her glory, became instead her burden. And it is the story of what happened after, the long sleep at the bottom of the sea, the slow work of historians trying to reconstruct exactly how large she truly was, and the debate that continues even now, whenever measurements are compared and old records are read again with fresh eyes. Before any of that, though, there is simply the fact of her, the plain, almost unbelievable fact that for a brief span of decades, a wooden ship taller than most buildings of her era, longer than a city block, carrying well over 100 guns, arranged across 4 full decks, sailed the oceans of the world under her own canvas, crewed by more than 1,000 men, and answered to the flag of Spain. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment, letting it settle the way the ship herself must have settled in the water when she was finally launched, displacing more of the harbour than anyone watching had quite expected. There is a kind of wonder in scale alone, apart from any story of battle or fate, and this chronicle intends to begin there, in the sheer, patient astonishment of a hull too large for its own age. If you find comfort in stories like this one, of great ships and the empires that built them, told slowly and without hurry, you are welcome to subscribe to this channel so that more of these chronicles find their way to you. That is the only invitation this telling will offer, and it is offered gently once and then set aside, because the story ahead deserves the full weight of your attention rather than the noise of repeated asking. What follows, then, is not a tale of shock or spectacle, though there is spectacle enough in a ship of this size. It is a slower kind of story, built the way she herself was built, plank by plank, deck by deck, across years of labour in a colonial shipyard far from the halls of Madrid, where the order for her construction was first signed. It is a story that asks the listener to sit inside the patience of another century, when the felling of a single forest could take years, when the seasoning of timber was measured not in weeks, but in the slow turning of seasons, and when the ambition to build something larger than anything before, it was not a matter of vanity alone, but of empire, of defense, of the felt need of a nation stretched thin across 2 oceans to answer its rivals with something no rival could match. The Santísima Trinidad did not appear from nowhere. She was ordered deliberately and with clear purpose by a crown that understood exactly what such a ship would mean, both to the enemies who would have to reckon with her guns, and to the Spanish sailors who would look up at her rigging and feel, perhaps for the first time in a difficult century for their nation, a flicker of the old imperial confidence. To understand why she was built at all, it is necessary to step back first from the ship herself and into the wider world that produced her. An empire at once vast and increasingly uncertain of its own strength, watching its rivals build ever larger and ever more numerous fleets, and searching, as empires so often do in their later years, for some grand gesture that might announce to the world that its power had not yet faded. That is where this chronicle will turn next. Not yet to the keel being laid, nor to the shipwrights at their work, but to Spain itself in the years before her construction, and to the pressures, ambitions, and anxieties of a court that decided, in the end, that the answer to its uncertainties might be built from oak and iron, 4 decks high, and sent out to sea under the most solemn name the Spanish language could offer, the Most Holy Trinity, a name meant to invoke protection, permanence, and a kind of divine assurance that no ship, however large, could ever entirely deserve. But before judgment, before battle, before the slow settling into sand and salt that would eventually claim her, there was simply the decision to build. And the long, patient work of turning that decision into timber rising from a shipyard in Havana. A fourth deck taking shape where no fourth deck had ever taken shape before. To understand why such a decision would be made at all, it helps to step back from the shipyard and look instead at the century that produced it, and at the empire that believed, for reasons both practical and prideful, that it needed a ship no one else had ever built. The 18th century was, for Spain, a long exercise in holding on. By the time the order for a new class of ship of the line was set down on paper, the Spanish Empire had already existed for more than 200 years, stretched across an ocean and a half, touching the coasts of Mexico and Peru, the islands of the Caribbean, the shores of the Philippines, and the long, thin line of settlements that ran up through Florida and into the edges of a continent still mostly unmapped by European hands. It was, on the map at least, still the largest empire the world had seen. But maps are patient things, and they do not show the cost of keeping such a reach intact. Every port, every garrison, every colonial administrator drawing a salary in silver depended on ships arriving and ships returning, on convoys that could survive the crossing, and on a navy strong enough to make certain that the wealth of the Americas reached Cadiz and Seville rather than the holds of a rival's frigates. This was the quiet arithmetic behind Spanish naval policy for most of the century. The empire was only as real as the fleets that connected it. Silver from Potosi, tobacco from Havana, dyes and hides and sugar. All of it moved across the Atlantic in convoys that had to be defended, year after year, against a rising tide of competitors who had grown hungrier and more capable with each passing decade. Spain had built its empire in an earlier age, when Portuguese and Spanish ships had the ocean largely to themselves. By the 1700s, that age was long over. Britain and France had become naval powers of the first rank. Each building fleets meant not merely to protect their own trade, but to threaten everyone else's. And Spain found itself in the uncomfortable position of an old empire trying to defend itself with the tools of a newer, harsher century. The rivalry with Britain was the sharper of the two, worn down over generations of skirmish and war, fought as much in the counting houses of trade as on the open sea. British ships harried Spanish convoys, British privateers tested Spanish coastal defenses, and British diplomats negotiated again and again for greater access to the ports of Spanish America. Access Spain resisted as a matter of both economics and pride. France, though nominally an ally through much of the century under the various Bourbon family compacts that bound the two crowns together, was still a rival in the broader contest for colonial trade and naval prestige. And Spanish naval planners were never entirely willing to trust that alliance to hold in every circumstance. The result was a kind of permanent vigilance, a sense, felt in Madrid and in the naval ministries, that Spain's fleets needed to be strong enough to matter regardless of who else was at the table. And strength, in the naval thinking of the age, was measured in ships of the line, those great multi-decked vessels, bristling with cannon on tier after tier, that formed the backbone of any serious fleet. The logic of the ship of the line was brutally simple. In a line of battle, the ship with more guns, better positioned and more heavily built, held the advantage, and a fleet's strength was often reckoned by how many first-rate ships it could put to sea, and how large those first rates were. Britain had been building formidable three-deckers for generations, ships like the great first rates of the Royal Navy that carried 100 guns or more, and had become, in the popular imagination as much as in naval registers, symbols of British sea power. France, too, had its own tradition of large and elegantly designed warships, admired even by rival navies for their handling and grace. Spain, watching these developments with the wary attention of a power that could not afford to fall behind, arrived at a particular answer to the question of how to compete. If size and gun count were the measures by which naval strength was judged, then Spain would build a ship whose size and gun count could not be matched by anyone. It was not, in the end, an irrational impulse. The maritime powers of the era were locked in a slow, expensive contest of shipbuilding, one where a single exceptional vessel could shift the balance of prestige, even if it never fired a shot in anger, and where the appearance of strength mattered nearly as much as its use. A four-decked ship of the line, carrying more guns than any first-rate afloat, would be more than a weapon. It would be a statement aimed as much at foreign ambassadors and rival admiralties as at any enemy fleet on the horizon. A way of saying, without a word exchanged in any treaty room, that the Spanish crown still commanded the resources, the skill, and the will to build what no one else dared attempt. It is worth pausing here on that idea, because it says something quiet but important about the age. A ship's size could function as a form of political language, spoken in timber and iron rather than diplomatic notes, but understood perfectly well by those who read it. Ambassadors in foreign courts reported on the size of rival navies as carefully as they reported on treaties and troop movements. A single enormous ship, moored in a home port or glimpsed by a foreign captain in passing, could alter perceptions of a nation's power far beyond what its actual military usefulness might justify. Spain's naval planners understood this. They were not merely building a warship. They were building an argument, one that could be read from the deck of any passing vessel. In a century where empires quietly measured one another by the size of what floated in their harbors. But an argument built in wood requires wood, and lumber, and rope, and iron, and above all, it requires skilled hands willing to shape all of it into something that would actually float and actually fight. And here the story turns, as so many chapters of Spanish naval history eventually turned, toward the Caribbean and toward the city that had become, almost by accident of geography and abundance, the empire's finest shipyard. Havana, on the northern coast of Cuba, held advantages that older Spanish yards on the peninsula could not easily match. The forests of Cuba were rich in hardwoods, particularly the dense, rot-resistant timbers so prized for hull construction. Woods that, by the middle of the 18th century, were becoming scarcer in parts of Europe after generations of shipbuilding had thinned older forests. Cuban shipwrights had, over decades, developed a reputation for skill that rivaled or exceeded that of yards in Spain itself. And the port's position, guarding the narrow strait through which so much Atlantic trade had to pass, made it a natural center of both naval defense and naval construction. Havana was not merely a colonial outpost with a shipyard attached. It had become, in its own right, one of the finest places in the entire Spanish world to build a warship. And by the 1760s and 70s, the Spanish crown had come to rely on it for some of its largest and most ambitious vessels. It was to this city then, humid and busy and thick with the smell of pitch and cut timber, that the ambitions of Madrid would eventually travel. Carried across the ocean not as a ship yet, but as an order, a set of instructions, and a design that called for something no Spanish yard, and indeed no yard anywhere, had built quite in this way before. The empire needed its argument spoken in the clearest possible terms. The forests of Cuba would supply the material. The shipwrights of Havana would supply the skill. And somewhere in the space between political necessity and craftsman's patience, a fourth deck would begin to take shape, rising above three that had, until then, been considered the practical limit of what a wooden hull could reasonably carry to sea. The decision did not arrive as a single stroke of inspiration. delivered by one visionary mind in a moment of ambition. It arrived instead the way most great undertakings arrive in the history of navies, through a slow accumulation of memoranda, calculations, and quiet conversations among men whose names would rarely be remembered outside the archives that recorded their decisions. The Spanish Naval Ministry, under the authority of the Crown and its officers of the sea, had watched the balance of power afloat shift and tighten for decades. France built well. Britain built often, and built with a discipline of production that unsettled every rival admiralty in Europe. Spain, holding an empire that stretched from the Caribbean to the Pacific, could not afford to fall behind in the one measure that mattered most when fleets met in open water. The weight of iron a single ship could throw, and the terror a single silhouette could inspire before a shot was ever fired. It was within this calculation that the order for the Santísima Trinidad took shape. The naval authorities who commissioned her were not dreamers indulging a taste for spectacle, though spectacle would certainly follow. They were administrators and engineers responding to a specific strategic problem, one that had occupied Spanish naval thinking since the middle of the 18th century. A fleet needed an anchor. In the language of the age, a battle line was exactly that. A line, ships arranged bow to stern in a great floating wall, trading broadsides in a slow and deliberate exchange that could last the better part of a day. Every line needed a center, a ship so heavily armed and so difficult to destroy that the enemy's own line would be forced to bend around her, that Allied captains could look toward her silhouette and know where the battle's spine had been planted. Spain wanted that ship to be hers, not merely large enough to serve in the line, but large enough to command it, to outgun any vessel that might come alongside her, to survive punishment that would break a smaller hull, and to end the argument of any rival captain who mistook boldness for wisdom. The specifications that emerged from this thinking were, by the standards of the time, almost provocative in their ambition. Spanish naval architects and their engineers, drawing on decades of experience building large ships in Havana's yards, proposed a vessel that would carry more guns than any ship afloat, arranged across more decks than any ship had carried before. 3 decks of guns had long been the practical ceiling for a wooden warship, a limit imposed not by imagination, but by the physics of timber, the tolerances of a hull under the strain of its own weight, and the recoil of dozens of cannon fired in sequence. To propose a 4th deck was to propose that Spain would simply refuse the ceiling that had constrained every other navy in Europe. It was a decision made not only in the language of naval strategy, but in the language of national identity, at a moment when Spain's empire, vast as it remained on any map, was increasingly aware of its own vulnerabilities, aware that maps alone could not guarantee safety on the water. This was, after all, an era intoxicated with scale, and Spain was hardly alone in that intoxication. Across Europe, navies competed not only in numbers of ships, but in the size of their largest vessels, treating tonnage and gun count as a kind of visible currency, a way of translating wealth and industrial capacity into a shape that rival courts could see, riding at anchor in a harbour. A ship of exceptional size did more than fight, she announced. She stood in port as a floating declaration that the nation behind her possessed the timber, the treasury, the shipwrights, and the will to build what others could not. For Spain, whose global reach depended on the safe passage of treasure fleets and colonial administrators across an ocean patrolled by rivals, both older and newer in their naval ambitions. This kind of declaration carried weight far beyond the tactical value of any single ship's guns. The Santísima Trinidad, even before her keel was laid, was already being asked to perform a kind of diplomacy, to speak on Spain's behalf in a language every European power understood instinctively, the language of size, of dominance made visible, of ambition given a hull. And yet the name chosen for this vessel spoke to something that sat alongside, and perhaps above, the political calculations of admiralty officials and royal treasuries. She was named for the Holy Trinity, the central mystery of the Catholic faith that bound Spain's empire together as surely as any treaty or trade route. To the men who ordered her built, and to the shipwrights and sailors who would spend years bringing her into existence, this was not a decorative flourish borrowed lightly from religious tradition. Spain in this period remained a deeply Catholic empire, one in which the crown's authority and the church's blessing were understood as inseparable threads of the same fabric. A ship carrying such a name was expected to carry something more than cannon and canvas. She was meant to carry a kind of sanctified purpose, an assurance, however unspoken, that her decks were consecrated to a cause greater than commerce or conquest alone. Sailors who served aboard her in the decades that followed would speak of the name with a seriousness that went beyond superstition, treating her as something closer to a floating cathedral of the state, a vessel whose very identity fused the sacred and the martial into a single towering hull. This fusion was not unusual for the age, but it was rarely pursued with such deliberate grandeur. Other Spanish ships bore the names of saints, of monarchs, of virtues the crown wished to associate with its fleet. Few, if any, reached toward the absolute center of Catholic theology in quite the way this ship's name did. To christen a vessel for the Trinity itself was to place her within a lineage of meaning that stretched back through centuries of Spanish maritime tradition, in which ships were blessed before launch, chaplains sailed among the crew, and the perils of the sea were understood as trials to be endured under divine providence, as much as under a captain's skill. The name would follow her from the yard at Havana to the waters off Cape Trafalgar, an unbroken thread of intention connecting the moment of her ordering to the moment, decades later, when she would finally be lost. Those who served aboard her, watching her towering sides rise above every other ship in a fleet, might reasonably have felt that a name so vast in its theological weight suited a hull so vast in its physical dimensions. Whether or not this comforted the men who would one day fight and die within her timbers is a question the surviving records cannot fully answer, but the intention behind the naming remains clear enough in the accounts that survive. This was to be no ordinary ship, and no ordinary name would do. None of this grandeur, however, could substitute for the labor that now had to follow. An order, however ambitious, however sanctified by name and purpose, remained only ink on paper until timber was felled, until keel blocks were laid, until hundreds of skilled hands began the long transformation of raw material into something capable of surviving the ocean's patience and violence in equal measure. The naval authorities in Madrid had made their decision. The theologians and clergy had lent their blessing to the name, but the actual creation of the Santísima Trinidad now passed into other hands entirely, into the world of master shipwrights, timber merchants, riggers and laborers who would spend years turning ambition into oak and iron. It was a peculiar feature of shipbuilding in this era that decisions made in council chambers, however weighty, ultimately depended on the patient, unglamorous persistence of men working with axes, adzes, and saws in humid dockyards far from the halls where the order had first been given. The empire had spoken. Now the forests would have to answer, and somewhere across the Atlantic, in the yards of a colonial port already known for producing some of the finest hulls in the Spanish fleet, that answer would begin, log by log, plank by plank, to take its slow and monumental shape. The port chosen for this labor was Havana, and by the middle of the 18th century, there was perhaps no shipyard in the Spanish Empire better suited to the task. The Arsenal de la Habana had grown, over decades, into something more than a colonial outpost of naval construction. It had become, in the quiet estimation of officers who compared such things across the Atlantic, one of the 2 or 3 finest yards flying the Spanish flag, rivaling even those of the peninsula itself in the quality of hulls it produced, if not always in the speed with which it produced them. The harbour at Havana was deep and sheltered, guarded by stone fortresses that had risen against the raids of earlier centuries, and the waters around it were calm enough, most months of the year, to allow the delicate work of launching a great hull without undue risk. But it was not the harbour alone that made Havana suitable for a ship of this ambition. It was what lay inland in the forests of Cuba, and it was the men who had learned, across generations, how to bring that timber down from the hills and turn it into something that could survive a lifetime at sea. At the head of the yard stood a master shipwright, a man whose training had likely come through the long apprenticeship system that governed naval construction in Spanish yards, where knowledge passed from senior builders to junior ones through years of watching, correcting, and slowly earning trust with tools that could ruin a hull if handled wrongly. The records of Spanish naval construction from this period are, as is often the case with the men who did the actual building rather than the ordering, thin and inconsistent, more concerned with tonnage and armament than with the names of those who shaped the wood. What survives suggests a figure accustomed to the particular challenges of colonial shipbuilding, someone who understood not only the geometry of a hull, but the specific behavior of tropical woods under Caribbean humidity, the way certain timbers resisted rot in ways that European oak simply could not match, and the patience required to season green wood in a climate that seemed, at times, determined to hasten decay rather than allow the slow drying that shipwrights in colder ports could rely upon. It was this last consideration, more than any other, that made Havana both a blessing and a burden for a project of this scale. The forests of Cuba held mahogany in quantities and qualities that were the envy of shipbuilders across Europe. Cuban mahogany, when properly cut and seasoned, possessed a density and resistance to marine rot that oak, for all its historic reputation, could rarely match. Ships built from mahogany in Havana's yards had a long and favorable record of surviving the attacks of the teredo worm and other borers that plagued vessels built from lesser wood in warmer waters. A matter of no small importance for a navy whose ships would spend years at a stretch far from any dry dock, sailing between the ports of empire in seas that ate away at hulls with a patience of their own. But mahogany trees of the size needed for a hull of this ambition did not grow quickly, and they did not grow conveniently close to the coast. The finest specimens stood deep in forests that had to be reached by cart track and river, felled by teams of axemen working in heat that made every hour of labor a negotiation with exhaustion, and then hauled, often by oxen, over distances that could take days to cover, before the logs ever reached a sawpit where they might begin to be shaped into something resembling a ship's timber. The labor of the yard itself, once the wood arrived, followed rhythms that had changed little in centuries, for all the ambition of the vessel being built. Sawyers worked in pairs over pits dug into the ground, one man above and one below, drawing long saws through timber that resisted with every stroke, the work made harsher by the weight of Caribbean heat that pressed down on the yard from morning until the light finally failed each evening. Adzes shaped the rough-sawn timber into the precise curves a hull required, each stroke a small negotiation between the wood's natural grain and the shape the shipwrights needed it to hold. Carpenters worked the frames into place, raising ribs of timber that would, in time, give the hull its shape long before any planking closed it in. And riggers, though their work lay properly in the later stages of construction, were often present even in these early months, coiling rope, testing blocks, learning the particular geometry of a ship whose masts, when finally raised, would tower over anything most of them had worked on before. The men who performed this labor numbered, by most estimates, in the hundreds during the peak months of construction. though the precise figures, like so much else about the individual laborers of this era, have not survived with any certainty. Some were free craftsmen, paid wages and drawn to Havana by the steady demand for skilled hands in one of the busiest yards in the Spanish Caribbean. Others were enslaved men, their labor extracted without wage or consent, a grim reality of colonial shipbuilding. In this period that historians have only in recent decades begun to examine with the attention it deserves. The records that survive rarely trouble themselves to distinguish between the two, listing labor in terms of tasks completed rather than names recorded. And this omission, this silence in the official ledgers, means that the individual carpenters, sawyers, riggers and haulers who gave years of their working lives to this single hull remain for the most part anonymous to history. They are present in the ship itself, in every joint and frame and plank, but absent from the story as it has usually been told, their contribution folded into the achievement of the empire and the reputation of the yard, rather than credited to the hands that actually did the work. What can be said with some confidence is that the daily life of the yard followed a punishing but steady rhythm, dictated by the sun and the tides and the endless demands of a hull that seemed, in its early months, to consume timber and labor without any visible progress to show for it. Work began early, before the full heat of the Caribbean day made heavy labor dangerous, and continued through the morning before a pause in the worst hours of afternoon heat, resuming again as the light softened toward evening. The sounds of the yard, had anyone thought to record them, would have been a constant accompaniment to this labor. The rasp of saws, the ring of axes against green wood, the shouted instructions of foremen directing the placement of frames, the creak of ropes and pulleys hauling timber into position. And beneath it all, the ever-present hum of insects and the distant calls of seabirds from the harbour beyond the yard's walls. Perhaps the most demanding aspect of the entire undertaking, more demanding even than the physical labour of shaping the wood, was the patience the project required at every stage. Timber for a hull of this size could not simply be felled and immediately worked. Green wood, full of sap and moisture, would warp and split if forced too quickly into the shapes a ship required. And so the seasoning process, the slow drying that allowed wood to stabilize before it could be trusted to hold its form under the strain of sea and weather, had to be allowed to proceed at its own pace, regardless of how the schedules of naval administrators in Madrid might have wished otherwise. Some timbers were felled years before the keel was ever laid, set aside to dry slowly in the shade of storage yards, while others were sought out specifically because they had already begun this process naturally, standing dead or long felled in the forest, their wood already partway toward the density and stability that a hull required. The shipwrights of Havana understood, in a way that the distant planners of the fleet perhaps did not fully appreciate, that a ship of this scale was not simply built. It was grown, in a sense, across years that stretched back before construction ever formally began, in forests that had to be found, assessed, felled, and patiently allowed to season, before a single frame could be trusted to bear the weight of the vessel that would rise above it. It was this patience, as much as the skill of any individual carpenter or the vision of any admiral in Madrid, that would ultimately determine whether the hull now beginning to take shape in the Havana yard could ever truly become the ship its planners had imagined. The keel itself, when at last it was laid, was less a single act than a ceremony drawn out across weeks, for a timber of such length could not simply be set down and pronounced whole. It was assembled from several great bulks, scarfed and bolted together, each joint inspected by men whose entire trade rested on knowing where wood might fail, long before it showed any outward sign of weakness. The date most often given for this beginning falls in the middle years of the 1760s, though the records that survive from the Havana yard are not always precise enough to satisfy a historian who wants a single afternoon to point to. a single moment when the keel of the ship that would become the Santísima Trinidad first rested in its blocks. What is clear enough is that from this point forward, the yard at Havana was committed. The timber had been chosen, the plans had been drawn and redrawn by shipwrights who understood that a mistake in these first weeks would echo through every year the vessel spent at sea, and there could be no turning back to a smaller design, no quiet abandonment of the ambition that had brought a 100-gun ship this far. From the keel, the frames rose. This was the part of construction that a visitor to the yard could actually see taking shape day by day, and it was also the part that carried the greatest weight of doubt among those responsible for the ship's success. A frigate's frames, or even those of a modest ship of the line, followed patterns that generations of shipwrights had tested and refined until the risk of failure had been reduced to something manageable, a known quantity weighed against known benefits. But this ship was to carry not 2 decks of guns, nor even the 2.5 that some of the larger ships of the age allowed themselves through partial batteries on a spar deck, but 3 complete decks of artillery, with room enough, in the ambitions of her designers, for still more should Spain's naval planners decide to add them later. No one at Havana, and few men anywhere in Europe, had built a hull meant to bear that arrangement of weight, and had watched it perform well across years of service. The frames, therefore, had to be heavier than convention suggested, spaced with a closeness that used more timber than a smaller ship would have required, and shaped with curves that account for how such a vast hull would need to resist not only the ordinary strains of wind and wave, but also the recoil of guns fired in broadside, gun after gun, deck after deck. The whole structure absorbing shock that no lesser frame could be trusted to withstand. The shipwrights who oversaw this work were not without their private uncertainties, and it would be dishonest to suggest that confidence in the design was universal. There is a long tradition, both in Spanish accounts and in the broader literature of naval history, of engineers and officials expressing concern that a wooden hull built to these dimensions might not hold its shape as it aged, that the very length which gave the ship her impressive silhouette might also work against her, allowing a slow sagging at bow and stern that sailors came to call hogging, a defect that plagued more than one large ship of this era, and that some later writers would associate, rightly or wrongly, with vessels built at this scale. Whether such doubts were voiced explicitly at Havana in the 1760s, or whether they belong more properly to later reflection on ships like her, the underlying caution they represent shaped the work at every stage. The men responsible for the frame did not treat their unprecedented task lightly. They overbuilt where they could afford the weight, reinforced junctions between frame and keel with additional bracing, and drew on whatever accumulated knowledge Spanish and, where available, other European shipwrights could offer about vessels that had pushed towards similar extremes, even if none had gone quite so far. Central to all of this was a simple, unglamorous fact that every person walking the yard understood, even if they rarely spoke it aloud. This ship would eventually carry, spread across her length and her multiple decks, more than 100 guns, cast in bronze and iron, each one weighing enough on its own to crush a careless man who let it slip from its tackle. The combined weight of that artillery, together with its carriages, its shot, its powder, and the men required to serve it, pressed down upon a frame that had never before been asked to bear quite this burden in quite this arrangement. Every foothook and every whale had to be understood not merely as a piece of a hull, but as a piece of a gun platform, one that would need to remain rigid and true through years of Atlantic swells, tropical humidity, and the occasional violence of battle. The shipwrights who selected and shaped the timber for these members worked with a caution that shaped the whole rhythm of the yard, rejecting pieces that carpenters on a smaller project might have accepted without a second thought, insisting on grain that ran true along the length of a piece, rather than diagonally across it, where hidden weakness might lie, waiting for the strain of a fully laden gun deck to expose it. All of this meant that the accumulation of labor at Havana was not measured in weeks, but in years. A slow and almost imperceptible growth that must have tested the patience of officials in Madrid who wanted news of progress, and instead received reports that, translated into plain terms, amounted to little more than the frames continue to rise, the timber continues to be fitted, the work proceeds according to the necessary care. For the men actually laboring in the yard, however, this slowness carried a different quality altogether. Each month brought some visible change, a new set of frames raised and secured, another section of the hull's shape becoming legible to the eye, where before there had been only scattered timbers and the plans that existed on paper in the drafting loft. Shipwrights who had begun the project as young journeymen found themselves, by its later years, senior men training apprentices on a hull that had, in effect, grown up alongside them. The building of such a ship was not an event that a single generation of labor could complete, in the way one might finish a smaller vessel within a single contract of employment. It asked for a kind of institutional patience from the yard itself, a willingness to keep resources, timber, and skilled hands committed to one enormous undertaking for years at a stretch, at the expense of other work the yard might otherwise have taken on. There is a particular image that recurs, in one form or another, across accounts of great ships built in this era, and it likely held true at Havana as much as anywhere else. It is the image of officials, sometimes visiting dignitaries from Spain, sometimes simply the yard's own overseers making their rounds, pausing at the edge of the construction site to look up at the ribs of the ship as they rose against the sky. By the later stages of framing, the skeleton of the hull would have stood taller than most buildings in the surrounding town, an open lattice of curved timber through which the sea and the harbour traffic beyond could still be glimpsed, a structure that must have seemed, to anyone unfamiliar with shipbuilding on this scale, more like the bones of some enormous creature than the beginnings of a vessel meant to float. Workers moved along scaffolding lashed to the outside of the frames, hauling timber into place with block and tackle, calling instructions to one another in the particular shorthand that develops among men who have spent years working together on a single, shared task. It is easy to imagine, and consistent with what little the surviving record suggests, that even those most accustomed to the yard's daily rhythms found themselves occasionally stopping to simply look, struck by the sheer physical fact of what was rising in front of them, a scale that exceeded anything most of them had built before, and would very possibly exceed anything most of them would ever build again. This slow raising of the hull, patient and unglamorous as it was, formed the true foundation of everything the ship would later become. The guns, the rigging, the ornament, the reputation she would carry into battle at Trafalgar decades later, all of it rested upon frames chosen and shaped during these early years at Havana, upon the caution of shipwrights who understood that the weight of 100 guns could not be trusted to timber selected in haste. Whatever doubts attended the project, and whatever admiration it inspired among those who watched it rise, the hull that slowly took shape through the closing years of the 1760s was being built to last, built to carry weight no ship of her nation had carried before, and built, above all, with the kind of care that only years of patient labor could provide. By the spring of 1769, the labor of years had resolved itself into something that could, at last, be seen whole. The scaffolding that had ringed the hull for so long, that had made her look for a time like a wooden hill wrapped in the bones of some larger creature, began to come away in sections, and what stood, revealed beneath it, was a ship whose proportions seemed, even to those who had watched her rise, plank by plank, difficult to hold in a single glance. She had been laid down as a design for a ship of the line of considerable power, and she would leave Havana as exactly that, a 3-decked vessel of imposing size. though the fame that would later attach itself to a fourth deck lay still in the future. A modification she had not yet received and could not yet have been imagined to need. What she was in that spring was already enough to draw crowds to the waterfront, already enough to be spoken of as something unusual, even in a port well accustomed to the sight of large ships under construction. Seen from the harbour, she presented a hull of dark, oiled timber, rising in long, disciplined curves from waterline to rail. Her sides pierced along their length by the black mouths of gun ports arranged in even ranks, deck above deck, each row marking a battery of guns whose combined weight of fire placed her among the most heavily armed vessels afloat. Her lowest battery, closest to the water and carrying her heaviest guns, sat low and confident along a waterline built thick with the layered planking of a hull meant to endure the recoil of iron and the long grinding pressure of Atlantic swell. Above it rose the second battery, lighter in caliber but no less imposing in its unbroken line of ports, and above that a third, so that from a small boat passing beneath her side, a man might count 3 distinct ranks of muzzles staring down at him, before his eye ever reached her weather deck, where lighter guns still stood ready among the coils of rope, and the movement of men going about the last work of fitting her out. It was a face built to be looked up at, and those who first saw her complete often admitted in letters and reports that have survived in fragments that the sight was difficult to describe without resorting to comparisons that seemed almost immodest for a workaday ship of the line. Comparisons to fortresses, to floating walls, to structures that seemed to belong more properly to a city than to the sea. Her rigging, when it went up in the weeks following the removal of the scaffolding, added a second kind of scale to the first. 3 masts, each stepped through decks that themselves stood taller than most buildings in the yard around her, rose in stages, their lower sections thick as the trunks of the oldest trees, felled for her construction, tapering upward through top and top, gallant until the highest points seemed almost to lose themselves against the sky. The work of stepping the masts, of hauling the great bulks of timber into place with block and tackle, and the strength of gangs of men singing to keep their pulling in time, took days, and the yard held its breath more than once as a mast swung free above the deck before settling true into its step. Once rigged, she carried a spread of canvas that matched her hull in scale, yards crossing her masts in tiers, so that a man standing at her base and looking up saw not simply masts but an entire architecture of wood and rope and canvas suspended above him, each element sized to match a ship whose hull alone had already strained the limits of what the yard's slipways were built to hold. Her ornamentation, modest by the standards of some royal flagships of earlier decades but still considerable, gathered at her stern and at her bow, where carved work picked out in paint and gilding gave her the visual signature that separated a great ship from an ordinary one. At her stern, elaborate carving framed the windows of her aftercabins, figures and scrollwork rendered by hands accustomed to the particular discipline of decorating something that would spend its working life exposed to salt spray and sun rather than sheltered in a gallery. And at her bow, a figurehead stood out over the water, the carved emblem that would be the first part of her that any approaching vessel saw, long before the guns beneath it came into view. The paintwork along her sides, applied in the weeks before launch, gave her hull the dark, almost black hue common to the great ships of her era, broken by the pale line of her gunport lids and by touches of colour at bow and stern that caught the sun and gave her, even at rest, the appearance of a vessel already in motion. Among the ships of the line then afloat under any flag, she was reckoned from the moment of her completion among the largest, a classification that rested not on any single measurement, but on the accumulated weight of her guns, the number of her decks, and the sheer volume of timber and cordage that had gone into her making. Spain had built large ships before, and would build others after her, but few among her contemporaries, in any navy, matched the particular combination of scale and firepower she represented when she was finally ready to leave the ways. It was this reputation, forming even before she had sailed a single mile, that gathered such a crowd to the Havana waterfront on the day set for her launch. The ceremony itself followed patterns familiar to any port that had sent large ships into the water, though the scale of this particular vessel gave the familiar rituals an added weight. Clergy attended to bless the hull and the men who would sail her. Officials from the yard and from the colonial administration gathered in their formal dress, and ordinary people of Havana, drawn by weeks of rumor about the giant taking shape on the slipway, crowded every vantage point along the shore and in small boats kept at a respectful distance from the ways. The final work of knocking away the blocks and shores that had held her in place fell to the shipwrights themselves, men who had spent years shaping her and who now performed the last physical labor of releasing her, blow by blow, from the cradle that had supported her through her construction. There was a particular tension in this work, quiet beneath the noise of the crowd, because the moment of release could not be perfectly predicted, and a hull of such size, once it began to move, carried a momentum that no team of men could arrest by hand should something go wrong in the final instance. When she began to slide, she did so slowly at first, the great mass of her hull seeming almost reluctant to leave the ways that had held it so long. And then with gathering speed as the incline and her own weight took hold, until she struck the water in a rush that sent spray high along both sides and drew, according to the accounts that survive, a sound from the assembled crowd that mingled cheering with something closer to gasping. The sound of people confronted suddenly with the scale of what they had built. She settled into the water, riding lower and steadier than some had feared and higher than others had hoped. And in that settling, in the simple fact that she floated true and did not list or founder in her first minutes afloat, the anxieties that had accompanied her construction found their first and most important answer. The builders who watched her ride at anchor in the harbour in the hours after her launch carried, by every indication left in the record, a mixture of feelings that would be recognizable to any craftsman who has finally released a long labour into conditions beyond his control. There was pride, plainly, in having brought a ship of such unprecedented scale from felled timber to a floating hull without the kind of catastrophic failure that had haunted the project in its early years. But there was also, inevitably, a quieter apprehension. The shipwright's knowledge that a launch was only the first and most visible test of a design, that the true trials of her seaworthiness, her handling under sail, her behavior in heavy weather, all lay still ahead, unproven, and that no ceremony on the water's edge, however grand, could answer those questions in advance. She rode at her mooring that evening as both an answer and a question, the largest proof yet offered of what Spanish shipwrights at Havana could achieve, and the beginning of a long test whose outcome no one present could yet know. For nearly 2 decades after that evening at Havana, the Santísima Trinidad sailed as a great ship among great ships, formidable, admired, but not yet singular. She carried her 3 decks of guns across the Atlantic and back, served in the waters of the Caribbean and along the coasts of Spain, and earned the kind of reputation that came to vessels of her size and dignity, spoken of with respect in the ports where she anchored, watched with a certain wariness by those who might one day face her in battle. But the world she had been built for was not a still one, and the decades that followed her launch were decades in which the nature of naval war itself continued to shift, in which the fleets of Britain and France grew heavier, their broadsides more numerous, their captains more willing to close and grind rather than maneuver and withdraw. A ship built to overawe by her mere presence could not remain content with that alone forever. And so, in the final years of the 1780s, when the Trinidad had already spent the better part of 20 years afloat, the decision was made in Madrid to send her back into the hands of shipwrights, not for the ordinary maintenance that any vessel of her age required, but for an alteration that no one, in any navy of Europe, had yet attempted at such a scale. The plan, as it came down through the Naval Ministry and into the yards, called for the addition of a fourth deck of guns, raised above the three she already carried, transforming her silhouette entirely, and, with it, her purpose. It was not a modest undertaking. To add a full deck of artillery to a hull already among the largest ever built was to ask an old and proven structure to bear a burden it had never been designed to carry. And the reasoning behind so bold a step deserves to be understood on its own terms before the engineering of it can be appreciated. The naval architecture of the age had entered a period of quiet but relentless escalation. Ships of the line were growing heavier, gun for gun, admiralties on both sides of the English Channel, and beyond commissioning vessels whose broadsides could deliver ever greater weights of iron in a single exchange. And Spain, watching this arms race unfold among rivals she could not afford to fall behind, looked to her own fleet and asked what could be done with what she already possessed. The Trinidad, immense already, offered an answer that a new construction could not. Rather than lay down another keel and wait years for a new giant to rise, the Crown's engineers proposed to make the giant already afloat greater still, to give her a fourth tier of cannon and, with it, a weight of fire that no other ship then sailing could match. It was a solution born of both ambition and economy, the kind of decision that looks, from a distance of centuries, either visionary or reckless, depending on which part of the story one chooses to weigh most heavily. The engineering risk was not a minor consideration set aside in the enthusiasm of the plan. It sat at the center of every conversation among the shipwrights charged with carrying it out. For a wooden hull, however massive, was not an infinitely forgiving structure. Every additional gun, every additional length of planking, and every additional deck beam raised the ship's center of gravity, shifted the distribution of weight that her original designers had calculated with such care, and threatened to alter, in ways not fully predictable, how she would ride the water and respond to wind and wave. A ship that sat too high, too heavy above the waterline, risked becoming unstable in exactly the conditions a warship could least afford. Instability, a heavy sea, a sudden gust, the roll of a hull already straining under the recoil of dozens of guns firing in sequence. The men who took on the work at the yard understood this risk not as an abstraction, but as the central problem of their task. And they approached it with the same patient, incremental methods that had characterized the original build decades before. The hull was strengthened where the new deck's beams would bear down upon it. Additional structural members worked into a frame never intended to hold them, in the hope that the ship's proven bones could be persuaded to accept an unproven burden. There was no way to test such a modification except by completing it and sending her to sea, and the shipwrights who carried out the work did so, knowing that their reputations, and quite possibly the lives of the men who would eventually crew her, rested on calculations made with the tools and knowledge available to naval architecture in that era. Tools considerable for their time, but still far short of certainty. When the work was finished, the ship that emerged bore little resemblance, in profile if not in her essential bones, to the vessel that had slid down the ways at Havana. She now rose in 4 ranks of gun ports along her sides, a configuration that no other ship of the line, in any navy then sailing the world's oceans, could claim. It was this alteration, more than her original launch, more than her already considerable size among the ships of her era, that transformed the Santísima Trinidad from merely a great ship into something without precedent. A singular vessel whose like had not existed before and would not exist again in quite the same form. Other navies built large ships, some nearly her equal in tonnage or in gun count, spread across 3 decks, but none had taken the deliberate step of raising a 4th tier of cannon above the water. And this decision, born of Spain's particular circumstances and her particular anxieties about the shifting balance of naval power, gave the Trinidad a distinction that outlasted her service and followed her into the historical record as her defining characteristic. She became, in the language of sailors and later of historians, a ship apart, spoken of not merely as large but as unique, the only four-decked warship the age of sail would ever produce in significant, lasting form. And yet even this transformation, so visually and structurally distinct, has not settled into the tidy certainty that a listener might wish for. Historians who have studied the Trinidad's rebuild have found themselves in disagreement over precisely how many guns she carried after the alteration was complete, and over what her displacement, the true measure of her bulk and weight in the water, actually became. Contemporary accounts vary, some counting somewhat above 120 guns across her four decks, others suggesting a total closer to 140 when smaller pieces mounted on her upper works are included in the reckoning, and the surviving records from the Spanish Naval Administration, incomplete and occasionally inconsistent with one another, have not allowed later scholars to resolve the question with full confidence. Some of the uncertainty traces back to the practical reality that a ship's armament in this era was not always fixed. Guns could be added or removed between voyages, adjusted according to the mission at hand or the availability of ordnance at a given port, so that the Trinidad's exact gun count may genuinely have varied across the years following her modification rather than settling into a single, stable figure that historians might simply fail to have recorded correctly. Displacement, too, remains a matter of estimate rather than settled fact, calculated by later researchers working from partial dimensions and comparative naval architecture of the period, rather than from a complete technical record that would allow a definitive figure. This lingering uncertainty, rather than diminishing the ship's significance, has become part of her enduring character in the historical imagination. She's remembered as the largest and most heavily armed ship of her age, a title that historians largely agree she deserves in spirit, even where they cannot agree on its precise arithmetic. And the very difficulty of pinning down her exact statistics speaks to how far beyond ordinary categories she had moved, once that fourth deck was raised above her hull. She had been built as an answer to a particular ambition, and modified into something that ambition alone could scarcely account for, a wooden giant carrying more cannon than any vessel before her, riding higher and heavier upon the water than her original builders had ever intended, sailing now toward decades of service, and, eventually, toward the battle that would fix her place in memory more firmly than any launch or any refit ever could. To understand what the Santísima Trinidad had become, it helps to look outward, toward the fleets that shared her waters and her age. The late 18th century was a period in which the great naval powers of Europe measured themselves, in part by the ships they could put to sea, and by the years of the 18th century's closing decades, a quiet contest had settled over the shipyards of Britain, France, and Spain. A contest fought not with cannon, but with timber, with tonnage, with the number of guns a hull could be made to carry without breaking apart under its own ambition. Britain's Royal Navy, the largest and most experienced fleet afloat, built its supremacy on numbers rather than singular giants, favouring fleets of capable three-decked first-rates such as the Victory, ships built to a proven pattern, reliable in their handling, formidable in their gunnery, and produced in sufficient quantity to dominate through weight of combined firepower rather than through any single vessel's individual grandeur. The French Navy, meanwhile, had long pursued a different philosophy, one that prized speed and elegance of line, producing ships that sailed faster and handled more gracefully than their British counterparts, though often at some cost to the raw number of guns they carried. Spain occupied its own position within this contest, a nation with vast colonial holdings to defend and immense wealth to protect as it crossed the Atlantic. and a navy that had, across the 18th century, built some of the most technically accomplished ships of the age, guided by shipwrights and naval engineers who had absorbed lessons from across Europe and adapted them to Spain's particular needs. Within this broader contest, the Santísima Trinidad occupied a category entirely her own. She had not been built to outpace the French in speed, nor to match the British in sheer number of hulls. She had been built and then rebuilt to answer a different question altogether. How large could a wooden warship be made, and how much destructive power could a single vessel carry into a single engagement? In this pursuit, she had, by the time of her final configuration, surpassed every rival afloat. No British first-rate carried her weight of ordnance. No French flagship, however admired for its lines, matched her in raw scale. Even among Spain's own considerable fleet, she stood apart, a vessel that had grown beyond the categories her contemporaries still occupied. 4 decks of guns rising above the waterline, where every other major warship of the era carried 3. She was, in the plainest sense, available to the sailors and officers who saw her. The largest warship in the world, and she would remain so for the whole of her active career, a distinction that no other vessel of her generation could claim. Yet size alone did not guarantee superiority in every sense that mattered at sea. And the story of the Santísima Trinidad's place among the giants of her age is not a simple tale of triumphant scale. Her handling had never been without difficulty. A hull built for 3 decks, however skillfully reinforced, however carefully rebuilt with a 4th tier of guns pressed atop it, carried within its very structure a set of compromises that no amount of shipwright skill could entirely erase. She sat higher in the water than her original design had intended, her center of gravity raised by the additional weight above her waterline. And this made her, according to the accounts of officers who served aboard her and in her company, a ship that rolled more heavily in a swell than her lower-built rivals, and one that answered her helm with a certain reluctance, a slowness of turn that could matter greatly in the close, fast-moving maneuvers of a fleet action. She was not built for speed, and she had never been intended to outrun an enemy or to slip gracefully between the lines of an opposing formation. What she offered instead was weight, an overwhelming concentration of firepower that, when properly positioned within a line of battle, could shatter an opposing vessel before that vessel came close enough to answer in kind. Naval strategists of the era understood this trade-off well, and it shaped the way the Santísima Trinidad was used within Spain's fleet across the decades of her service. Not as a nimble instrument of pursuit or maneuver, but as an anchor, a fixed point of overwhelming strength around which the rest of a battle line might organize itself. A ship whose presence alone could stiffen the resolve of Allied captains and unsettle the calculations of an approaching enemy. It was this presence, more than any tactical statistic, that seems to have most impressed the sailors who encountered her. Whether they served under the same flag or watched her approach from the deck of an opposing vessel. Accounts from British officers who saw her in the years before. Trafalgar describe a ship that dominated the horizon in a way no other vessel could, her 4 tiers of gun ports stacked one above another, her sides painted in the manner common to Spanish ships of the line, her masts rising higher than anything around her, so that even at a distance, before her nationality or her name could be confirmed, sailors could identify her simply by her unmistakable silhouette, a shape unlike any other ship afloat. There is a particular kind of awe reserved for scale that exceeds ordinary expectation, and this seems to be precisely what the Santísima Trinidad inspired wherever she sailed. Allied Spanish and French sailors serving alongside her in combined fleet operations spoke of the confidence her presence lent to a formation, the sense that whatever else might go wrong in an engagement, the great 4-decker anchoring one section of the line represented an obstacle no enemy captain could approach lightly. British sailors, for their part, seemed to have regarded her with a mixture of professional respect and something closer to wonder. An acknowledgement that whatever doubts existed about her handling or her practical value in a fast-moving action, there was something undeniably impressive about a hull raised so high, carrying so many guns, that she seemed to belong to a different scale of shipbuilding altogether than anything else afloat in the world's navies. This reputation, built gradually across years of visibility in Spanish and combined fleets, gave the Santísima Trinidad a kind of symbolic weight that extended beyond her practical value in battle. She became, for Spain, a floating emblem of national ambition and technical achievement. A ship that could be pointed to as evidence that Spanish shipwrights and Spanish naval engineering stood equal to anything produced in the yards of Britain or France. Whatever doubts might quietly persist among her own officers about how she handled in a heavy sea, or how quickly she could be brought about when circumstances demanded speed over strength. She was shown, when the opportunity allowed, to visiting dignitaries and foreign officers. Her scale offered as a kind of demonstration, a physical argument for Spain's continued relevance among the great naval powers of the age, at a time when Spain's colonial fortunes and its standing in Europe had begun, in other respects, to show signs of strain. And so she settled into the decades that would follow her final rebuilding, a ship whose reputation had been established not through a single dramatic action, but through her mere continued existence. Her visible presence in port after port, campaign after campaign, a fixture within the Spanish fleet, whose scale alone guaranteed her a kind of enduring fame, even before the battle that would eventually define her memory. She sailed now not as an experiment or a novelty, but as an established feature of Spain's naval strength, carried forward year upon year into service across the Atlantic and along the coasts of Europe, into engagements large and small, into the ordinary rhythms of provisioning, repair, and readiness that occupied most of a warship's working life. The great contest among nations to build ever larger and more powerful ships would continue long after her own launching, stretching forward into centuries she would never see. But for the years allotted to her, the Santísima Trinidad stood as its most visible answer, a wooden giant riding at anchor or under sail, unmatched in size by any vessel of her time, carried now toward the long, unglamorous decades of active duty that would test, far more thoroughly than any admiring glance from a foreign deck, whether a ship built this large could truly endure the ordinary demands of a working navy. For a ship built to embody the ambitions of an empire, the years that followed her launching brought something quieter than glory. The Santísima Trinidad did not spend her decades in constant battle, nor in a single dramatic voyage that history could point to and call her purpose fulfilled. Instead, she settled into the long, patient rhythm of naval service, moving between the ports of Spain and her colonies, carrying flags and cargo and admirals, standing at anchor in harbors from Havana to Cadiz to Cartagena, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming less a wonder and more a workhorse, though one that never entirely lost the aura of her origins. She had been built to awe, and awe she continued to provide. But awe alone could not exempt a ship from the ordinary toll of salt water, tropical heat, and the accumulated wear of thousands of days at sea. In her earliest years of active duty, the Trinidad served much as her builders had intended, as a visible symbol of Spanish naval reach across two oceans. She crossed the Atlantic more than once, threading the routes between the Iberian Peninsula and the Caribbean that had carried Spanish silver and Spanish ambition for centuries before her keel was ever laid. These crossings were not merely transport, they were demonstrations. A ship of her size, moving with the ponderous majesty that 4 decks and over 100 guns demanded, was itself a form of diplomacy. Other nations watched her pass, noted her presence in a harbor, recorded her name in their own dispatches. She did not need to fire a shot to make her point. Her silhouette alone, rising higher above the water than any other ship afloat, spoke plainly of what Spain believed itself capable of building, and by extension, capable of defending. She served, too, as a flagship, and this role suited her as much as any other she would come to occupy. To carry an admiral was to carry the fleet's authority, and there was no vessel in the Spanish Navy better suited to hold that weight than the Trinidad. Her upper decks, with their commanding view and their spacious quarters, gave a commanding officer both the literal and symbolic elevation that rank demanded. When she sailed at the head of a squadron or rode at anchor with an admiral's pennant flying from her masthead, she became something more than a ship. She became the visual center of Spanish naval power, the point around which formations were organized and toward which foreign observers directed their attention. Accounts from officers who served under her decks describe a vessel that inspired a particular kind of confidence. Not the confidence of speed or agility, for she possessed neither in great abundance, but the confidence of sheer permanence. To stand upon her deck was to feel, however briefly, that the ship beneath one's feet could not be moved by anything the sea or an enemy might offer. This was not merely sentiment. In the years before her final campaign, the Trinidad took part in engagements and operations that tested her capabilities without yet demanding the full sacrifice that would come later. She was present during conflicts that pitted Spain against Britain in the long contest for Atlantic and Mediterranean supremacy that defined much of the 18th century's final decades. In these earlier engagements, she performed the function for which she had been designed, absorbing punishment that would have broken a smaller ship, delivering broadsides of a weight few vessels could match, and serving as a rallying point for the rest of the fleet when battle lines grew confused and communication between ships became difficult amid smoke and cannon fire. She was damaged in these years, as any warship engaged in genuine combat would be. Her rigging cut, her hull struck, her crew reduced by the ordinary casualties of naval warfare. But she survived, and in surviving, she added to the growing reputation that already surrounded her, a reputation built as much on her endurance as on her size. Beyond combat, she undertook diplomatic voyages as well, carrying dignitaries and representing Spanish interests in ports where a show of naval strength served purposes that no treaty or letter could achieve on its own. These voyages, less celebrated in the historical record than her battles, nonetheless occupied a significant portion of her working life. A ship of her stature was, in a sense, always performing, whether she carried an admiral to a diplomatic conference or simply rode at anchor in a foreign harbour while negotiations proceeded on shore. Her presence alone was a form of argument, and Spanish captains and diplomats alike understood the value of having such an argument available to make. Yet for all the grandeur these roles suggested, the years were not kind to the Trinidad in the way that years are never kind to any wooden vessel asked to spend decades upon salt water. The sea does not distinguish between ships built for glory and ships built for utility. It corrodes and rots and strains them all according to the same slow, indifferent processes. The Trinidad's timbers, however carefully selected and however skillfully joined by the shipwrights of Havana, began to suffer the same afflictions that eventually claimed every wooden ship of her era. Shipworm bored into her hull below the waterline, a persistent and largely invisible enemy that no amount of vigilance could entirely defeat, particularly in the warm waters of the Caribbean, where such creatures thrived. Rot crept into sections of her frame that could not always be reached or replaced without extensive and costly work. Her rigging, exposed constantly to sun, salt, and storm, required continual renewal, the ropes and cables that held her towering masts in place, wearing through and needing replacement with a regularity that consumed enormous quantities of hemp and enormous hours of labor. To address these accumulating burdens, the Trinidad underwent several significant refits during her career. periods in which she was brought into dockyards and subjected to extensive repair, and, in at least one notable instance, substantial rebuilding. These refits were not merely maintenance. At certain points, they amounted to a genuine reconstruction of portions of the ship, addressing structural weaknesses that had emerged from her original, ambitious design. It was during one such period of rework that shipwrights added further alterations to her upper structure, modifications that some accounts suggest contributed to the very feature for which she remains most remembered. Though the precise sequence and extent of these changes remains a matter that later historians would continue to examine and debate. What is clear from the surviving records is that the Trinidad required more sustained attention than most ships of her navy, a consequence perhaps inevitable in a vessel that had always pushed against the practical limits of what wood, rope, and canvas could reasonably support. The dockyard workers who tended to her during these years left little in the way of personal testimony, but the nature of their labor can be inferred from the ship's own history. Caulking seams that had opened under the strain of her own weight, replacing sections of planking weakened by years of exposure, restepping masts that had shifted or cracked under the pressure of wind and sail. These were the unglamorous tasks that kept the Trinidad afloat and functional across decades of service. Each refit extended her working life, but each also served as a quiet reminder that even the largest ship afloat remained subject to the same physical laws that governed every other vessel that had ever put to sea. She could awe onlookers with her scale, but she could not exempt herself from decay. There is something worth pausing over in this long middle period of her existence, the years between her celebrated launching and her equally celebrated end. It is in these decades, largely unremarked in popular memory, that the true character of the ship perhaps emerges most clearly. Not in the drama of a single battle, nor in the spectacle of her construction, but in the patient, unglamorous accumulation of voyages made, repairs completed, and duties fulfilled. She had been built as a statement, but she lived, for most of her existence, as a working vessel, subject to the same routines, the same maintenance schedules, the same slow attrition of salt and time that governed every ship of her age. The grandeur that had attended her birth settled over these years into something more durable and less spectacular. A reputation for endurance, for reliability under strain, for being the ship that could be counted upon to hold a line or carry a flag when smaller vessels might falter. It was this accumulated history, this long record of service and repair and quiet endurance, that the Trinidad carried with her as the political and military tides of Europe began, in the final years of the 18th century, to shift toward the conflict that would define her forever in the memory of those who came after. The decades under the Spanish flag had tested her thoroughly, and she had, in her own patient way, answered every test. What remained now was the campaign that would ask more of her than any refit could prepare her for, a reckoning that was drawing steadily closer across the waters she had sailed for so long. To live aboard the Santísima Trinidad was to live inside a small floating town, one built of oak and rope and packed with more souls than most villages of the age could claim. Records from the period suggest her complement could swell beyond 1,000 men when fully manned for battle, a number that placed her among the most densely populated vessels afloat, larger in this respect than many of the warships that would face her. To imagine that many bodies pressed into a single hull, however vast, is to begin to understand both the grandeur and the strain of existence within her. She was a marvel of engineering and ambition when viewed from the water, her four decks rising in tiers of timber and gunmetal. But from within, she was something else entirely, a world of narrow passages, low beams, and constant human proximity, where privacy was a luxury reserved only for the most senior officers, and even they were not entirely spared the closeness of shipboard life. The rhythms of that life were governed, as they were on every vessel of her era, by the watch system, the ancient division of the day into segments that determined who worked, who rested, and who stood ready should the sea or an enemy demand sudden attention. The bell that marked these divisions became, over months and years at sea, less a sound than a kind of heartbeat, felt as much as heard, its steady tolling threading through the hours of darkness and daylight alike. Sailors moved through their duties according to this ancient clock, some climbing into the rigging to manage her sails, others descending into the depths of the hull to tend her stores, her pumps, or the endless labor of keeping so large a vessel, functioning as a coherent whole rather than a mere accumulation of timber and rope. The discipline required to maintain such coordination among so many men was itself a kind of achievement, one that surviving accounts suggest was managed through a blend of naval regulation and the practiced instinct of officers who had learned, often over decades, how to keep order within wooden walls. The senses aboard such a ship told their own story, one that no painting of her graceful lines could fully capture. The smell of pitch, used to seal her seams against the relentless intrusion of seawater, mingled with the sharper, more acrid scent of gunpowder that lingered near her magazines and gun decks even when her cannon lay silent. Below decks, where sunlight rarely penetrated and lanterns swayed with the ship's motion, the air carried the weight of bodies too numerous for the space they occupied, along with the more particular odors of bilge water, salted provisions, and the tar used in her rigging. Sailors of the period wrote, when they wrote at all, of these smells with a kind of resigned familiarity, the sensory backdrop against which the more dramatic moments of their service unfolded. The sounds were no less constant, the groan of timber flexing against the sea's pressure, the creak of her decks underfoot, the distant thud of feet moving in coordinated haste when orders were given, and beneath it all, always, the endless murmur of water against her hull, a sound so continuous that sailors often reported, upon returning to land, a strange unease at its absence. Within this vast wooden world, distinctions of rank created their own geography. The officers' quarters, situated toward the stern in the tradition of the age, offered what comfort the ship could provide, though even these spaces were modest by the standards of shorebound life. Senior officers might have a small private cabin, its walls thin enough to carry sound from the decks above and below, its furnishings simple but functional, a writing desk, a berth, perhaps a chest for personal effects, and the instruments of navigation and command. For men of lesser rank, particularly the ordinary sailors who formed the bulk of her enormous crew, sleeping arrangements were far less generous. Hammocks, slung in tight rows between the guns of her lower decks, provided the only rest most would know, swaying gently with the ship's motion, close enough to a neighbour's that the war of elbows and shifting bodies was simply another accepted feature of life at sea. When the ship rolled in heavier weather, the entire mass of sleeping men rolled with her, a strange, synchronized motion that bound the crew together in the most literal sense. The gun decks themselves, the source of her unprecedented power and the reason for her fame among the fleets of Europe, doubled as living space during the long stretches when battle was not imminent. The cannon that would one day roar in fury at Trafalgar spent most of their existence as silent companions to the men who slept, ate, and worked in their shadow. Ropes and tackle for their operation hung ready nearby, a constant reminder that peace aboard a warship was always provisional, always subject to sudden and violent interruption. The sheer scale of the Trinidad meant that these decks stretched on with a length that must have seemed, to a young sailor newly assigned to her, almost cavernous, and yet the density of men and material within them ensured that no space, however vast in principle, ever felt truly spacious in practice. Meals aboard the ship followed their own modest rhythm, prepared in galleys that fed the hundreds who required sustenance through arrangements that surviving naval records describe with the careful, unglamorous detail typical of institutional record-keeping. Salted meat, hard biscuit, and whatever fresh provisions could be secured during port calls formed the basis of the crew's diet, supplemented on better days by wine or its equivalent, distributed according to custom and regulation. The preparation and distribution of these meals required its own careful choreography, another layer of coordination necessary to keep so many men functioning across the ship's long voyages and extended periods at anchor. It would be a mistake to imagine this existence as one of unrelieved hardship, though hardship was certainly present in ample measure. There was, alongside the discomfort and the density and the endless labor, a kind of pride that surviving accounts suggest many aboard the Trinidad felt in service upon so singular a vessel. She was, after all, a wonder of her age, spoken of with a mixture of awe and skepticism throughout the naval circles of Europe. And to serve upon her was to be attached, in some small way, to that reputation. Officers and sailors alike understood, even amid the discomforts of daily existence, that they inhabited something unusual, a ship whose scale and ambition set her apart from the ordinary run of vessels that made up the bulk of any fleet. This blend of grandeur and hardship, of pride and discomfort, defined the peculiar texture of life within her hull, a texture that no single account fully captures, but that emerges in fragments from the letters, logs, and administrative records that survive from her decades of service. Those surviving accounts are, admittedly, incomplete, scattered across archives and shaped by the particular concerns of those who happened to write them down. Officers' logs tend toward the practical, recording weather, position, and the routine business of command, while personal letters, where they survive at all, offer glimpses of the more human dimensions of shipboard existence: homesickness, camaraderie, the small pleasures and larger anxieties that attended service so far from land and family. Historians piecing together the daily life of the Trinidad's crew have had to work with these fragments, assembling from them a picture that remains, in its details, somewhat provisional, though the broad outlines seem clear enough. Life aboard her was demanding, communal to an extent scarcely imaginable in the modern world, and shaped at every turn by the peculiar demands of a vessel, whose very size, the source of so much pride and fascination among those who observed her from without, imposed its own particular burdens on those who lived and worked within. By the year 1805, the currents of European power had settled into a pattern that would have seemed, only a decade earlier, difficult to predict. Spain, once the great rival of France upon both land and sea, found herself bound to her former adversary by treaty and by necessity, drawn into an alliance that served the ambitions of a French emperor, whose reach now extended across most of the continent. The arrangement suited neither party entirely. Spain's ministers understood well enough that their nation's fleet, however proud its lineage, existed now largely to serve purposes decided in Paris rather than in Madrid. Napoleon, for his part, regarded the Spanish navy as a useful instrument, a supplement to his own maritime ambitions. Though he harbored doubts, seldom voiced but evident in his correspondence, about the readiness of ships and crews he had not himself trained and could not entirely trust. It was an alliance of convenience, built upon the shared recognition that Britain's command of the sea threatened the interests of both powers, and it would be tested in the months that followed, in ways that neither Spanish nor French planners fully anticipated. The immediate cause of the gathering crisis lay in Napoleon's designs upon the British Isles themselves, a project of invasion that depended, as all such projects must, upon control of the waters through which an invading force would need to pass. For this, the Emperor required a fleet capable of contesting British naval supremacy, if only for the weeks necessary to escort his army across the Channel. The combined fleets of France and Spain, brought together under a single command, were meant to serve this purpose, drawing British naval strength away from home waters long enough for the invasion to proceed. It was, in its conception, an ambitious scheme, and one that placed enormous weight upon ships and commanders who would ultimately prove unequal to the burden asked of them. Through no particular failing of courage, but through the accumulated weaknesses of blockade, of insufficient training, and of a strategic situation that had, by the autumn of that year, begun to slip beyond anyone's full control. The combined fleet that assembled in the waters near Cadiz numbered some 33 ships of the line, drawn from both the French and Spanish navies, representing between them a considerable proportion of the naval strength that both nations could muster. Among these vessels, the Santísima Trinidad held a place of particular distinction, not merely for her size, which remained unmatched by any other ship present, but for the symbolic weight she carried as the flagship of the Spanish contingent, sailing under the flag of Vice Admiral Don Baltasar Hidalgo de Cisneros, an officer whose long career in Spanish service had prepared him, as well as any preparation could, for the responsibilities now placed upon his shoulders. The overall command of the combined fleet rested with the French Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, a man whose position had been secured through the Emperor's confidence, but whose private correspondence, preserved in the archives that historians would later study, reveals a commander increasingly burdened by doubt, aware of the gap between what his fleet was asked to accomplish and what it seemed capable of achieving. Villeneuve's doubts were not without foundation. The ships under his command, Spanish and French alike, had spent long months confined to harbour by the British blockade, their crews deprived of the sustained sea time that alone could build the seamanship and gunnery proficiency upon which naval success ultimately depended. The Spanish ships in particular suffered from chronic shortages, their crews filled out with soldiers and landsmen pressed into naval service for want of trained sailors, a consequence of years of financial strain that had left the Spanish Navy unable to maintain the professional cadres its ships required. The Santísima Trinidad herself, magnificent as her four decks appeared to observers ashore, carried a crew whose composition reflected these broader difficulties. A mixture of veteran gunners and hastily assembled recruits whose combined effectiveness in the crisis of battle remained, as autumn approached, an open question that only combat itself could answer. The days preceding the fleet's departure from Cadiz were marked, according to the accounts that survive, by a mood compounded of anticipation, uncertainty, and the quiet fatalism common to men who understood that the coming days would demand of them a reckoning they could not avoid. Napoleon's instructions, transmitted through channels that grew increasingly urgent as the weeks passed, pressed Villeneuve toward action, toward a decisive engagement that would fulfill the strategic purpose for which the combined fleet had been assembled. Villeneuve himself, sensing perhaps more clearly than his emperor the risks involved, hesitated, and this hesitation, communicated back to Paris, provoked a response that left him little choice but to sail, regardless of his private reservations about the readiness of his ships and the disposition of his crews. It was, in the manner of many decisive moments in military history, a choice made under pressure that left no room for the caution that better circumstances might have permitted. Aboard the Santísima Trinidad, the officers and crew prepared for departure with the particular blend of routine and solemnity that such occasions demanded. The great ship's decks, cleared for action in the days before sailing, took on the appearance familiar to generations of sailors preparing for battle. The guns run out and secured, the powder and shot arranged in the magazines below. The countless small tasks of a warship's preparation carried out by men whose individual thoughts, whatever they may have been, have left little trace in the historical record. What survives instead are the broader impressions gathered from letters, from later testimony, from the accounts of officers who recorded something of the atmosphere that prevailed in those final days. There is mention, in several of these sources, of a duty accepted rather than embraced, a recognition among experienced officers that the combined fleet sailed into an engagement whose outcome remained genuinely uncertain, against an adversary whose reputation for tactical innovation and relentless pursuit of decisive victory had grown in recent years to something approaching legend among naval professionals on both sides of the coming battle. That adversary, the British fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, had spent the preceding weeks maintaining a patient watch over the waters near Cadiz, waiting for the combined fleet to emerge from its harbour refuge. Nelson's reputation, forged through earlier victories at the Nile and at Copenhagen, preceded him into these final days before what would become the most consequential naval engagement of the age. And there is reason to believe that officers within the combined fleet, Spanish and French alike, understood something of what they faced in facing him. Nelson's tactical approach, which departed from conventional naval doctrine in ways that would only become fully apparent once battle was joined, remained at this stage a matter of speculation among his opponents, who could prepare only in general terms for an engagement whose specific character none of them could yet foresee. The combined fleet sailed from Cadiz on the 19th and 20th of October, moving out into open water under conditions that offered little indication of the violence that awaited within days. The Santísima Trinidad, taking her place among the towering ranks of ships of the line that made up the combined force, presented to those who watched her depart the same impression of overwhelming scale that had accompanied her throughout her long career. Her foredecks and their mast batteries rising above the surrounding vessels in a manner that seemed, to contemporary observers, to promise a strength commensurate with her size. Whether that promise would be fulfilled remained, as the fleet moved into the waters off Cape Trafalgar, a question that only the coming engagement could settle, and settle it did, in a manner that would fix the ship's name permanently within the larger story of naval warfare, though not in the manner that her builders, so many decades before in the yard at Havana, could ever have anticipated or intended. The days immediately preceding the battle passed in the particular suspended tension that precedes any great and terrible event whose approach can't be avoided. Weather reports preserved in ship's logs describe conditions that shifted between calm and unsettled, a fitting accompaniment to the mood that historians have inferred from the surviving correspondence of officers on both sides. Men who understood, with varying degrees of clarity, that the 21st of October would bring a reckoning long delayed by blockade and diplomatic maneuvering, a reckoning that the massed strength of the combined fleet, the Santísima Trinidad, foremost among its towering vessels, now sailed forward to meet. The morning of the 21st came in slowly, the sea catching a low swell that rolled the great hulls without violence, and the light, when it finally spread across the water off Cape Trafalgar, revealed two fleets drawing toward one another in a silence that the sources describe as unnatural, given what was known to be coming. The combined fleet of Spain and France stretched in a long, uneven line, more than 30 ships of the line strung across the water like a wall built of oak and canvas, and the Santísima Trinidad held her place within it, her foredecks rising above her neighbours, as they had risen above every port she had ever entered. A shape unmistakable even at a distance, even through the haze that hung low over the strait that morning. Admiral Villeneuve's flagship led the French contingent, and Admiral Federico Gravina commanded the Spanish ships within the same great formation. And among the accounts that survive from officers aboard the Allied vessels, there is a shared sense, expressed in different words, but arriving at the same conclusion, that the British approach, when it became visible on the horizon, did not come as expected. The British fleet, under the command of Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, did not approach in the traditional line that naval doctrine of the age would have anticipated. a long parallel formation trading broadside for broadside in a manner that battles of the previous century had made familiar. Instead, the British ships came on in two columns, sailing directly toward the combined line at something close to a right angle, a formation that risked exposing the leading ships to sustained fire without the ability to answer in kind, a risk that Nelson and his captains had apparently judged worth taking, in exchange for the chance to break the enemy line into fragments that could be isolated and overwhelmed one by one. The ships of the combined fleet watched this approach for what the surviving logs describe as a long and uncertain interval, the columns growing larger against the sky, the details of rigging and gun ports becoming visible only slowly, the tension of the weight recorded by more than one officer as heavier than the battle itself would prove to be. When the British columns reached the line, they did not stop to exchange fire at range in the old manner. They drove directly into the gaps between the Allied ships, and the maneuver that naval historians would study for generations to come began to unfold in exactly the way Nelson had intended, though at a cost that would prove severe on both sides. HMS Victory, Nelson's own flagship, aimed for a point in the line near the Santísima Trinidad and the French ship Bucentaure. And in the confusion of smoke and maneuver that followed, the great Spanish ship found herself engaged almost immediately by multiple opponents, a circumstance that her size and her prominence within the fleet had perhaps made inevitable from the moment the battle plan revealed itself. The Santísima Trinidad's silhouette, so long a source of pride in Spanish ports, became in the context of the battle a kind of beacon, drawing fire from ships that might otherwise have divided their attention across a wider portion of the line. British captains, seeing the four decks rising above the smoke that soon began to gather across the water, directed their guns toward her with a concentration that the ship's own size seemed almost to invite, as though the very quality that had made her a wonder in peacetime became, in the hour of battle, a liability written into her frame. She could not hide her scale. She could not blend into the smoke as smaller ships sometimes managed to do, slipping from one engagement to another with a discretion her towering decks denied her. She stood and she was seen, and the ships that closed upon her did so with the deliberate intention of ships closing on a prize too large and too significant to be allowed to survive the day unchallenged. The fighting that followed has been described in the accounts of surviving officers with a consistency that suggests the chaos was, in its way, uniform across the fleet. A great confusion of smoke and thunder in which individual ships lost sight of their neighbors and captains fought half-blind, guided by sound and by the occasional clearing of the haze rather than by any clear view of the larger battle. The noise alone, according to more than one surviving account, exceeded anything the officers had encountered in previous engagements. The combined roar of hundreds of guns firing without pause across a stretch of water no more than a few miles wide, a sound that men described afterward as having filled the body rather than merely the ears, a physical pressure as much as an auditory one. Amid this noise, the Santísima Trinidad's own guns answered as best her crew could manage, her lower decks working in conditions that grew steadily worse as the battle wore on, heat and smoke filling the enclosed spaces where men who could not see the sky loaded and fired by rote, guided by officers whose voices, too, were nearly lost beneath the general thunder. The damage that accumulated upon her in the hours that followed came in stages that the surviving accounts, fragmentary as they are, allow to be traced with some confidence. Her masts, so long the visible crown of her silhouette, began to fall one by one under the sustained weight of enemy fire. The rigging that had once caught the wind across 3 oceans, now falling in tangled ruin across decks already crowded with the wounded and the dead. Her upper decks, exposed to the arcs of fire from the surrounding ships, suffered the heaviest toll among the men stationed there. the marksmen and gun crews who worked in the open air bearing a burden that those below, however hard their own labor, were spared. Accounts differ on the precise sequence in which her masts came down, some sources suggesting all three were lost within a relatively short span of the engagement, others describing a more gradual dismasting spread across several hours. But the general picture agrees that, by the battle's later stages, the ship that had once towered so distinctly above every harbour she entered now sat low and disfigured upon the water, a hulk stripped of the rigging that had given her motion and grace. The human cost aboard her, recorded in casualty figures that vary somewhat between sources, but that consistently describe losses among the highest of any ship present that day, reflected the concentration of fire she had drawn from the opening movements of the battle onward. The wounded filled spaces never designed to hold them, and the ship's surgeons, working by lantern light in the lower decks where the air itself had grown foul with smoke, and the closeness of too many suffering bodies, continued their work through hours that the survivors would later describe only in fragments, memories too painful, perhaps, to be rendered whole even in the retelling. It is a measure of the battle's scale and its violence that the ship remained a scene of such continuous labor and suffering for as long as she did, her guns firing even as her masts fell, even as her upper decks emptied of the men who had manned them at the battle's start. By the mid-afternoon, dismasted, battered, and surrounded by British ships that pressed their advantage with the persistence the circumstances demanded, the Santísima Trinidad could no longer offer the resistance her size had once promised. The moment of her surrender, when it came, is described in the surviving accounts not as a sudden collapse, but as the final acknowledgement of a condition that had been approaching for some hours. The ship's officers recognizing, with whatever grief the recognition carried, that further resistance served no purpose beyond the further loss of men already exhausted and wounded beyond counting. Her colours, when they came down, did so over a deck littered with the wreckage of her own masts and rigging, a giant brought low not by any single blow, but by the accumulated weight of an afternoon's continuous bombardment. A slow dismantling of the very grandeur that had once made her the pride of every port she had graced. The battle around her continued for some time after her surrender, the wider engagement grinding on toward the outcome that would soon be known across Europe. But for the Santísima Trinidad herself, the fighting was over, and what remained was only the question of what would become of a ship so grievously wounded, so far from any harbour capable of receiving her. In the uncertain hours that followed, the guns falling silent. The men who came aboard her in the failing light of the 21st of October found a ship that seemed less like a vessel than a ruin still afloat by some stubborn agreement between her broken timbers and the sea beneath them. The British prize crew sent to take possession of the Santísima Trinidad moved through decks littered with the debris of the day's fighting, past dismounted guns and shattered rigging, past the wounded who had not yet been carried below, and past the dead who had not yet been carried anywhere at all. She had struck her colours as the etiquette of the age required, but the surrender of a ship this size was not a simple matter of raising a new flag and setting a course for a friendly port. She could barely be moved. Her masts were gone or going, her rudder answered sluggishly if at all, and the great hull that had once been spoken of with something close to disbelief now sat low and unsteady in a sea that had not yet finished with her. The battle itself ground on around her for hours after her own guns had gone quiet, the wider contest between the combined fleets and Nelson's ships resolving itself ship by ship across a wide and smoke-darkened stretch of water off Cape Trafalgar. But for the Trinidad, the fighting was over, and what replaced it was a different and in some ways more delicate struggle. The effort to keep her afloat, to keep her prisoners and her wounded alive, and to decide, in the confusion following any great battle, what could possibly be done with a captured giant so far from any port built to receive her. The weather did not wait for these questions to be answered. Within a day of the battle's end, the same waters that had carried the fleets into position began to rise into something far less forgiving. A storm swept in from the Atlantic, the kind of autumn gale that any sailor of the period would have recognized as dangerous even to a ship in full health. And the combined fleets, victors and vanquished alike, found themselves fighting a new and less glorious battle, simply to keep their vessels together. For ships already damaged by the day's fighting, the storm was close to catastrophic. Masts that had survived the battle came down under the strain of wind they were never rigged to withstand. Hulls that had held together under cannon fire began to take on water they could not pump out fast enough. And among these struggling ships, none was in more danger than the Santísima Trinidad, whose foredecks and towering profile, once her glory, now made her a vast and unmanageable weight for a small British prize crew to control in rising seas. The accounts that survive describe a desperate effort to save her. British sailors, working alongside what remained of her own exhausted crew, manned the pumps in relays through the worsening weather, fighting to keep the water in her hold from rising faster than it could be cleared. Other ships attempted to take her under tow, passing lines across the heaving distance between vessels in conditions that made even the simplest maritime tasks difficult and dangerous. For a time, it seemed possible that she might be saved, that the largest warship afloat might yet be brought into a friendly harbour as the ultimate trophy of the battle, a captured giant to be paraded before the public and studied by naval architects for years afterward. But the storm did not relent, and the hull beneath all that ambition had already been asked to endure more than any wooden ship should reasonably survive in a single day. The decision that followed was not made lightly, though the sources disagree on precisely how the deliberation unfolded aboard the ships involved. What is clear is that, as the storm continued and the water continued to rise within her, the officers responsible for her fate concluded that she couldn't be saved. The tow lines, if they had held at all, were cut or allowed to part. The order went out to evacuate her surviving crew and her wounded, a task that was itself a formidable undertaking given the conditions, the number of men involved, and the limited capacity of the smaller boats attempting to move between the heaving vessels. Boats that had been lowered in calmer water now had to be worked through swells that threatened to capsize them, ferrying the injured and the able alike away from a hull that everyone involved understood was not going to see harbour. The evacuation stretched across hours, conducted in weather that made every crossing between ships a small crisis of its own. Wounded men, many of them already suffering from injuries sustained during the battle itself, had to be lowered into boats that rose and fell with a violence that must have made even the healthy among the crew reluctant to trust their footing. Some accounts describe men lost in the transfer itself, swallowed by seas that no one on either side had time to properly mourn, amid the larger effort simply to save as many as could be saved. The work continued as long as it could, British and Spanish sailors labouring together in a task that made little distinction, in that moment, between captor and captive, victor and vanquished. What mattered was getting men off a hull that was slowly and unmistakably settling deeper into the water beneath them. By the time the last boats pulled away, the Santísima Trinidad had been stripped of nearly everyone still capable of leaving her. What happened next, no one aboard remained to witness in full, though the outcome was never seriously in doubt once the evacuation was complete. Sometime in the hours that followed, off the coast near Cadiz, the great four-decked hull that had dominated the harbours of Havana and Cartagena, that had carried her towering rows of guns across decades of Spanish service, slipped beneath the surface and settled onto the seabed, joining the many ships on both sides that the storm claimed in addition to those the battle itself had already taken. There is a particular quality to the loss of a ship in this manner, one that no chronicler of the age could entirely avoid, noting even amid the larger accounting of casualties and outcomes that followed Trafalgar. The Santísima Trinidad had not gone down fighting, guns blazing to the last, in the manner so often imagined for great warships lost in battle. She had surrendered, been boarded, been claimed as a prize, and then been lost anyway. Not to any enemy broadside, but to wind and water, and the simple accumulated damage of a day she had spent absorbing punishment from more ships than any single vessel, however large, should reasonably have been expected to withstand. The largest warship afloat, a vessel built to project the power and ambition of an empire across the width of an ocean, ended not in a blaze of resistance, but in a slow, administered surrender to the sea itself. A fate that felt, to those who recorded it, strangely fitting for a ship whose scale had always exceeded her practical usefulness. She had been, from her earliest days, a vessel more suited to impressing observers than to surviving the ordinary hazards of naval warfare. And in the end, it was not the battle that finished her, but the storm that followed it. A reminder that no amount of timber and ambition could fully outmatch the sea on a night it chose to be unforgiving. The human cost of those hours deserves to be stated plainly rather than dwelt upon with any excess of sentiment. For the men involved would likely have wanted nothing more than the simple acknowledgement that they had suffered and, in many cases, died in service to a ship and a cause they had not chosen for themselves. The battle had already claimed a substantial portion of her crew before the storm ever began its work, and the losses sustained in the confusion of the evacuation, however carefully conducted, added further names to a toll that no single account manages to render with full certainty. What can be said honestly is that many men died aboard her, in the fighting and afterward, and that their deaths were treated, by the standards of the age, with the same solemn and unremarkable finality accorded to every other loss of that long and costly day. There were no grand memorials raised for the Trinidad's dead in the years that immediately followed, no separate accounting kept apart from the larger tally of the battle's casualties. They were simply among the fallen of Trafalgar, sailors of an empire that had built, in this one vessel, something it could not ultimately protect, and whose names survive, where they survive at all, only in the fragmentary muster rolls and correspondence that later historians would spend generations attempting to piece back together. In the years that followed the storm off Gibraltar, what remained of the Santísima Trinidad settled into that particular kind of historical absence, reserved for things too large to vanish entirely and yet too broken to be found whole. She had not gone down intact, as some ships did, preserved in a single resting place where divers and historians might one day return to measure her timbers against the old records. She had come apart in pieces, battered first by British guns and then by the sea itself, and what fragments drifted from her in those final hours scattered across waters that no expedition of the following century would ever definitively chart. There is, to this day, no confirmed wreck site bearing her name, no hull resting on a seabed shelf where researchers might lower instruments and settle, once and for all, the question of exactly how large she truly was. What survives of the Trinidad survives on paper, in the ledgers of the Havana yard, in the correspondence of officers who served aboard her, in the muster rolls that listed her guns and her complement across the different years of her service, and in the fragmentary eyewitness accounts of men who saw her afloat and tried, each in his own way, to describe something that seemed to exceed the ordinary vocabulary of ships. This absence of a physical wreck to consult has shaped the way historians have approached her ever since. Where other famous vessels of the age have yielded their secrets slowly to marine archaeology, their keels measured, their timbers dated, their fittings recovered and displayed in museum cases, the Trinidad has remained a creature of the archive rather than the seabed, Scholars working on her history have had to rely on a patchwork of documents produced at different times for different purposes, often by men who had reason to exaggerate, or, just as often, no particular reason to be precise. Shipyard records from Havana list dimensions and timber counts related to her original construction. But these figures describe a vessel that existed only briefly in that form, before the modifications of the 1790s added the additional deck that made her famous. Naval inventories from later years list her gun count, but naval inventories were living documents, amended as ships were refitted, and the number of guns she carried seems to have varied across her career in ways that later chroniclers did not always trouble to distinguish by date. This has left the question of her true size a genuinely open one, and it is worth pausing to notice why. When later writers speak of the Trinidad carrying somewhere between 130 and 140 guns, they are not being careless. They are reporting a real ambiguity present in the surviving sources, an ambiguity born of a ship that was reconfigured more than once during her service, and whose armament seems to have been counted differently by different officials at different moments. Some records from her final years describe additional guns mounted temporarily, guns that may have been counted in some tallies and omitted in others, depending on whether they were considered part of her permanent establishment or simply added for a particular campaign. Historians examining these records side by side have found themselves less able to offer a single definitive figure than to offer a range, bounded by the most conservative and the most generous of the surviving accounts, and to explain, patiently, why the range exists rather than pretending it does not. The question of displacement presents a similar difficulty, compounded by the fact that the concept itself was measured and recorded with less consistency in the period than it would be in later naval administrations. Figures describing her tonnage survive from different points in her career, calculated according to different formulas that were themselves subject to revision during the decades of her service, so that a modern reader comparing two period sources may find numbers that appear to disagree, while in fact simply reflecting different methods of calculation applied to a ship that was, in any case, changing in configuration across those same years. Later, naval historians attempting to translate these period figures into terms comparable with other ships of the age have arrived at estimates that broadly agree on her extraordinary scale relative to her contemporaries, while differing at the margins in ways that reflect the genuine uncertainty of the underlying data rather than any failure of scholarship. It is in this space between record and legend that the Trinidad's reputation as the largest warship of her age has lived for more than 2 centuries, at once affirmed and gently questioned by successive generations of historians. The affirmation is not difficult to understand. Every surviving account that describes her alongside other ships of the period, whether Spanish, French, or British, speaks of her as visibly, unmistakably larger, a vessel that drew comment for her size wherever she appeared, whose silhouette was noted specifically for exceeding the ordinary line of battleships around her. The addition of the 4th deck in her Havana refit gave her a claim to a particular kind of superlative that no rival ship of the period could match, since no other navy of the age built and sustained a 4-decked ship of the line in comparable numbers or for comparable service. On this point, the historical consensus has held remarkably steady. Whatever her exact gun count in any given year, she was almost certainly the largest ship of her type afloat during the period of her active service. And this claim rests on evidence broad enough and repeated often enough across independent sources that few serious historians have troubled to dispute it. And yet the gentler questioning persists, not because anyone doubts her extraordinary scale, but because the precise superlatives attached to her name over the years have sometimes outrun what the sources can strictly support. The claim that she was the largest wooden warship ever built, repeated often in popular accounts, requires careful qualification when set against the full history of shipbuilding, since later constructions in other navies, built after her own service had ended, would in time exceed her in certain dimensions, even if none matched her particular combination of size and continuous, decades-long service as a fighting ship. The claim that she carried a specific, fixed number of guns throughout her career dissolves, as has been described, into the more accurate but less tidy statement that her armament varied across her different configurations, a fact that does nothing to diminish her scale, but complicates any attempt to reduce her to a single clean figure suitable for a plaque or a caption. This is, in the end, a difficulty common to a great deal of naval history from this period, and the Trinidad is not unique in presenting it, only unusually prominent in the degree to which popular memory has sought a single, definitive number where the sources offer several plausible ones. Historians who have devoted careers to the Spanish Navy of this era have grown accustomed to this tension between the tidiness that legend prefers and the untidiness that archives actually contain, and the more careful among them have tended, in recent decades, toward presenting her dimensions and her armament as ranges rather than certainties, acknowledging openly that the surviving documentation, however extensive, was never produced with the modern historian's desire for precision in mind. It was produced by naval officials managing an active fleet, by shipwrights accounting for materials, by officers reporting to superiors who wanted operational information rather than a record built to satisfy future scholarship. What remains certain, and what no reasonable reading of the surviving evidence disputes, is that the Trinidad was regarded in her own time as something exceptional, a ship that drew comment wherever she sailed, that anchored the center of Spanish battle lines by virtue of her sheer visible presence, and that ended her service in a battle whose scale and consequence have kept her memory alive, long after the specific figures attached to her decks and her guns became a matter of careful qualification rather than simple statement. The open question of her exact size has not diminished her standing so much as clarified the terms on which that standing rests. Not on a single unassailable number, but on a body of testimony, consistent across independent witnesses and documents, that she was, by the measure of her age, among the largest ships ever to carry sail and cannon into battle, whatever the precise figures that measure might ultimately prove to be. There is a kind of water that keeps no record of what has passed through it. Off Cadiz, where the Atlantic swell meets the shallower currents of the bay, the sea today looks much as it must have looked on the morning the Santísima Trinidad went down, and much as it looked centuries before that, when smaller ships under different flags made their own crossings of the same stretch of coast. The water does not remember. It has no need to. It simply continues, rising and falling with the tides, indifferent to the names of the vessels it has swallowed and the empires that sent them out. And yet somewhere beneath that indifferent surface, broken into pieces too scattered and too degraded for any single expedition to reassemble into a coherent hull, lie the remains of the largest warship of her age, a vessel that once seemed, to those who built her and those who feared her, almost too large to be lost at all. It is worth pausing at the end of her story, not on the battle or the storm or the numbers debated by later scholars, but on what she represented in the longer arc of human effort. Because the Santísima Trinidad was never only a Spanish ship, or only a four-decked curiosity, or only a casualty of Trafalgar. She was one entry, admittedly an extraordinary one, in a ledger that stretches back long before Havana's shipyards, and forward long after her keel timbers rotted on the seabed. That ledger records an old and recurring human impulse, the desire to build something larger than what came before, to press wood and iron and rope past their comfortable limits, to see how much a hull could carry and how much a nation could ask of its craftsmen. The pyramids were raised for reasons not unlike this. So were the cathedrals and the aqueducts, and later the iron liners and the steel dreadnoughts. Each age chooses its own material and its own ambition, but the underlying gesture repeats itself with remarkable consistency. A wish to make a mark large enough that it can't be ignored, whether by rival powers, by history, or simply by time. The Santísima Trinidad belongs to a very particular chapter of that gesture. The chapter written in oak and pine and hemp rope, in tar and pitch and iron nails, in the labor of Cuban shipwrights working in tropical heat to raise a hull that would eventually be armed for war in a cooler ocean thousands of miles away. She belongs, too, to the chapter written by naval architects and admiralties across Europe, who spent decades trying to answer, with each new keel laid down, a question that never had a final answer. How large could a wooden warship be made before the wood itself refused to cooperate? Every additional deck asked something new of a hull already strained by its own dimensions. Every additional gun asked something new of gunners and officers who had to coordinate an instrument far more complex than any single vessel built a generation earlier. The men who conceived of a fourth deck were not indulging in idle fantasy. They were extending a real engineering conversation that had been running, quietly and continuously, since ships first began carrying more than a single row of cannon to sea. The Santísima Trinidad did not begin that conversation, and her loss did not end it. Other navies would go on trying to build bigger and stronger vessels for another century, before iron and steam made the entire question obsolete. But for a span of years, she stood as the loudest single answer that conversation had yet produced. A hull large enough to draw comment from every navy that saw her, whether in admiration or in wary calculation. It is easy, at a distance of more than 2 centuries, to reduce a ship like this to spectacle, to remember only the fourth deck, only the size, only the strange fact of her survival, past the point when reason suggested she should have been broken up or reduced. But spectacle was never the whole of what she was. She was also an enormous quantity of ordinary labor. The felling of trees whose selection and seasoning had been managed with careful attention long before anyone imagined what ship they would become. The patient shaping of frames and planks by hands that understood wood the way a stonemason understands rock. The slow, repeated work of caulking and rigging and provisioning that had to be redone every time she was refitted or rearmed. Behind every dramatic fact about her size sits a much longer and much quieter history of maintenance, of officers writing reports about rot and cost, of dockyard workers whose names were never recorded, arguing with masts that would not sit properly, and timbers that had begun, in places, to show their age. That ordinary labor is easy to lose beneath the grander narrative of decks and guns and battles, but it was the actual substance of her existence for most of the decades she spent afloat. The battle that ended her service occupied a single day. The keeping of her occupied nearly 40 years. There is a particular kind of humility available in remembering that. A ship famous chiefly for her size was, in the end, no more exempt from the ordinary demands of upkeep than any smaller vessel in the fleet. If anything, her size made those demands heavier, not lighter. More timber to replace, more rigging to maintain, more men to feed and pay and discipline, more cost for an administration that could ill afford it in the years leading up to Trafalgar. The very quality that made her remarkable also made her a burden, and it is not an accident that so much of her later career was shaped by questions of expense and practicality as much as by questions of glory. Ambition, in the case of the Santísima Trinidad, was never separated from its costs. The two arrived together and stayed together for the whole of her working life. And it is that pairing, the grandeur and the grinding maintenance beneath it, that gives her story its particular texture among the many great ships that have been built and lost across the centuries. And yet the costs, in the long run, mattered less to her memory than the grandeur. This is often how it goes with great ships. The daily ledgers of upkeep, the arguments over funding, the tedious business of keeping a wooden giant seaworthy. All of that fades from memory far faster than the moment a vessel is seen for the first time, or the day she goes down beneath the waves. What survives in memory is the shape against the sky, the count of the decks, the astonishment recorded by witnesses who had never seen anything built quite that large before. The Santísima Trinidad outlived, in the sense that matters to memory, the empire that built her, Spain's colonial reach, the specific naval strategy that called for a ship of her size, the political calculations that placed her under Villeneuve's uncertain command at Trafalgar. All of that belongs now to the specialized study of historians, familiar chiefly to those who choose to look closely. But the image of a four-decked warship, larger than any other afloat in her time, has traveled far more widely than the political history that produced her, carried forward by paintings, by models, by the simple retelling of what she was and what became of her. In this, she shares something with many of the great ships remembered across the centuries. Their hulls are gone, their nations are transformed or vanished entirely, but the shape of what they attempted persists, passed down, not because it was strategically decisive, but because it was, in the plainest sense, extraordinary to imagine. If there is a single image worth holding onto at the close of her story, it might be this: the quiet water off Cadiz, unremarkable to look at, indistinguishable at a glance from any other stretch of Atlantic coastline, holding beneath its surface the scattered remains of a ship once so large that harbours struggled to receive her. No monument marks the spot in any way visible from the surface. No current still carries the shape of her hull, and yet the memory persists on land, in archives and museums, and in the retelling of her story, long after the specific timbers that made her have dissolved into the sea that finally claimed them. That, perhaps, is the quiet lesson offered by ships like the Santísima Trinidad, and by the long line of builders who reached, again and again across the centuries, for something larger than what had come before them. The wood does not last, the empires do not last, but the ambition, remembered carefully and passed on, sometimes does. If you have enjoyed this quiet passage through her story, you are welcome to stay a while longer. There are other great ships waiting to be remembered on this channel whenever you would like to find them.